For this topic is going to be looking at a coordinate plane and using the coordinate plane in different ways and using coordinates on a coordinate plane in different ways. So our first topic is going, or our first lesson in this topic is going to be looking at integers on the coordinate plane. And your learning target says, I can graph points on a coordinate plane by using quadrants, the origin, and ordered pair. And you'll notice that I put the language of the discipline icon on here because I just threw a ton of language of the discipline for you. Graphing points is going to be part of the language of the discipline. A coordinate plane is a language of the discipline. Quadrants, origin, and ordered pair. So we're going to spend some time going through talking about these and defining what each part of that learning target is before we actually get to the point of graphing coordinates on a coordinate plane. So this right here is going to be a coordinate plane that you will see a lot of. So a coordinate plane is going to be a grid that has two number lines that intersect at a right angle. So I've got my grid pattern, as you can see. I've got my two number lines and they intersect at a right angle. And I know it's a right angle because this tiny little thing right here makes a square. So I have a 90-degree angle. So this is my coordinate plane. Now, within my coordinate plane, there's a lot of vocabulary that wasn't in the learning target that you need to be familiar with. So this right here, this line running my horizontal line, this is what we call, and it's already been labeled, this is my x-axis. Okay. And then my vertical line, which runs up and down, is going to be my y-axis. So this is something that you're going to need to know is when we talk about the x-axis and the y-axis, it's going to be the points that are on those lines. And then we have this point here. So when we have this 0, 0 point, the 0, 0 point is my origin. So my origin is where I'm going to start. Every time I need to graph, I always start at 0, 0. So I'm going to write it like this. So I'm going to put it in parentheses, put a comma in between it, and this right here, how I wrote this is what we will call an ordered pair. So an ordered pair has two values in it. The values that it has is it's going to have an x-coordinate and a y-coordinate. The x-coordinate always is your first coordinate. The y-coordinate is always your second coordinate. So you need to remember that my x-coordinate is what I will graph first. That is my horizontal movement. So I'm going to move left or right depending on the value that I have there. And then I'm going to move my y-coordinate, which is going to be up and down depending on the value that I have. Take a look at some of the other pieces. So I define coordinate plane. Coordinate plane is where the grid, it's a grid pattern where two lines intersect at a 90-degree angle. We have our x-axis, which is my x line that runs horizontal, my y-axis, which runs vertical up and down. The origin is where I start counting or start plotting. So it's going to always be 0, 0. This is how I write an ordered pair. This is what an ordered pair is. I have my x coordinate, which always comes first, and my y coordinate, which always comes second. So that's covered a good chunk of that learning target. But there's another piece that we need to take a look at. So the other piece that we're going to take a look at is we're going to take a look at quadrants. Take a look at quadrants. What we're looking at is we're looking at how the coordinate plane is broken apart. And you can see that I have 4 quadrants within my coordinate plane. So I'm going to go through and we're going to talk about each quadrant. We're going to identify the characteristics of each quadrant. So quadrant 1, so my quadrant 1 is going to be here. Now quadrants are always done with Roman numerals, so you need to make sure that you label it with a Roman numeral. And the coordinates that I have in quadrant 1, I'm going to have a positive x and a positive y. So anytime I have two positive or I have an ordered pair that where both values are positive, I'm going to locate that in quadrant 1. Quadrant 2, I got to go counterclockwise. So quadrant 2 is going to be to the left of quadrant 1. Now my quadrant 2, my ordered pair that I'm going to have is I'm going to have a negative x and I'm going to have a positive y coordinate. So you'll notice that here, if we take a look on here, all of my x values are negative and all of my y values are positive. Quadrant 3, again moving counterclockwise, so quadrant 3 is going to be on the bottom. Love how I wrote that backwards as I was talking about counterclockwise. So quadrant 3, I'm going to have a negative x and a negative y coordinate. So if both my coordinates are negative, I'm going to be in quadrant 3. And then my last quadrant, as I move counterclockwise, is going to be quadrant 4. And quadrant 4 is going to have a positive x and a negative y value. So I need to be able to identify that quadrant 1 is positive, positive, quadrant 2 is negative, positive, quadrant 3 is negative, negative, and quadrant 4 is positive, negative. So I can just by looking at a coordinate tell which quadrant it needs to go in just simply by looking at whether the coordinates are going to be positive or negative. Okay, so I'm actually going to jump down on page 186 to the convince me. It says both coordinates of an ordered pair are negative numbers. In which quadrant is that point always located? So it's helpful when you guys first get started. I would just very much draw this on your graph paper. I would just draw, what I would do is I would just draw a coordinate plane and I would do quadrant 1, positive, positive, quadrant 2, negative, positive. Quadrant 3, negative, negative. And then quadrant 4, I don't know why I put that in parentheses. You don't need that in parentheses, would be positive, negative. So if I go to the convince me says which coordinates are both negative. So here I have positive, positive. Here I have negative, positive. Quadrant 3 would be my answer on the convince me because both values are going to be negative. Your answer needs to be with numeric symbols. Quadrants are represented with a Roman numeral. Okay, so we're going to take a look now how to do some graphing of some points. So let me pull back up my coordinate plane and then we will do some practice with the graphing. Coordinate grid pulled back up. I also wrote down some ordered pairs. So if you guys remember, I said that an ordered pair is going to be an x and a y coordinate. And so we're going to do a little bit of practicing with our quadrants before I go ahead and I plot this. So Q, if we take a look, what quadrant it's going to be in, I have a positive and a negative. So this is going to be in quadrant 4. Because my x is positive and my y is negative. R is negative x, positive y. So it's going to be in quadrant 2 because I have negative x, positive y. S is going to not be in any quadrants. S is actually going to be on the y axis. And I can tell that it's going to be on the y axis because I don't move left to right. So anytime I have a 0 in my x coordinate, I'm going to be on the y axis. And then let me show you what it would look like if I were going to be on the x axis. So if I had point T to be on the y-axis would be a 0 with the y. I'm sorry, to be on the x-axis, not the y-axis. This is going to be on the x-axis because I move left and right, but I don't move up or down. So let's go ahead and let's plot these coordinates and see where they end up. So to plot, I always start at the origin and I move with my x first. So I'm going to move left to right first. So my first coordinate is going to be Q. So I'm going to move over 2. So 1, 2, and then I'm going to move down 3. 1, 2, 3. I'm going to draw, make my point a little darker. Going to draw my point, and then I'm going to label it with a Q. Do the same thing for R. So I always start at that origin. I'm going to go over -1. So I'm going to go to the left one, and then I'm going to go up one. And then I'm going to make some clicks to get my point a little bit bigger. And then I'm going to label it with an R. Then I have my S point. So I don't go left or right, but I go up 2. So I'm going to label, I'm going to make my point, and then I'm going to label that with my S. So if they give me a letter, I need to go ahead and mark that with the letter. I don't, however, need to mark it with a value. And then my T is going to be 3 and 0. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. I don't go up or down because I have a 0 there. So it's going to be there, and I'm going to label it. So that is how I graph using an ordered pair. So you'll notice that I use the origin to move up and down, left and right to find my point. I also identified quadrants to see which quadrant they're going to be in, and I was right. This is quadrant 4, Q was in quadrant 4, R was in quadrant 2, S is on the y-axis, it's on the up and down line, and then T is on the x-axis as I only moved left or right. I did not move up or down. Okay, so let's take a look and see how some points are related. So I'm going to go ahead and get my coordinate grid set up for the next problem. Another example on page 187, and we're going to see how some coordinates are. We're going to look at quadrants, we're going to look at ordered pairs, and take a peek at them. So if I look at point M is going to be 3, -2. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mark that 3, -2. I'm going to just work my quadrants. I'm going to come over to N. N is going to be -3, 2. So I have -3, 2. That's a very good 3. Q is going to be, start on my origin, -3, -2. And then point P, start at the origin, is going to be 3, -2. So something I want to point out to you guys is I marked this one wrong, so let's fix that first. It's not 3, -2, it's 3, 2. Is if we take a look at the reflection. So here I am reflected across, so here I'm reflected across the y-axis. So when I'm reflected across the y-axis, if you take a look, when I'm reflected across the y-axis, my x-coordinates are opposites. But then when I reflect across the x-axis, let me change colors, x-axis. So when I reflect across the x-axis, I take a peek, my y coordinates are going to be opposites. So when I'm reflecting across the different axes, the coordinates are going to be the opposite. So if I look at N and Q, the opposite coordinate is going to, because I'm reflected across the x-axis, is going to be my y. I have 2, -2. Here, if I look at Q and P, I'm reflecting across the y-axis, so I look at my x. So I look at the opposite of what I'm reflecting across. I have -3, 3. Those values are opposite of each other. So a reflection is going to be across the axes. I'm going to have the opposite x and then the opposite y. Now if I go and I take a peek, so let me see if I can get a magical third color. So if I go across the x-axis and then reflect down across, if I reflect across the y-axis and then down across the x-axis, if you take a look at these two coordinates, you will notice that they are going to have reflections of each other across both axes. So I go from having a +2 to a -2, and then a -3 to a 2. If I take a look at Q and M, as I reflected across both axes, I have 2 positives here and 2 negatives here. So when it asks you to reflect across both axes, you need to go across the y-axis and then down over the x-axis to see what it is. So really here, when I